Thank you. Today, we stand at a crossroads. Before us are two paths. One path leads to a digital free land of people who own their own data, devices, and services. Empowered by this, they have the tools they need to safeguard their privacy, their civil liberties, and their human rights. The other path leads to a digital feudalism populated by digital serfs. They don't even have the option of owning their own data, devices, and services. Instead, they must rent them from faceless corporate landlords. Enfeebled by this, they enjoy neither privacy nor civil liberties nor human rights. We stand at this crossroads, and to understand our current predicament, we have to understand the road that led us to this point. So take a journey back with me, about 50 years or so, to a time before Google, before Apple, before smartphones, before Fitbits, when there was no internet. A time when computers filled up entire rooms, and if you wanted to use one, you had to drive to it. Now, computers back then were very different things. For one thing, they were external. There was nothing personal about them. They were disconnected from the world, and they were unaware of the world around themselves. And they were used primarily in the business. Now, this changed quickly. The year I was born, we got personal computers. They were personal not because we carried them upon our persons, they were personal because they were not used in the business. And again, very rapidly, they began to shrink in size, they became mobile, they became luggable, then portable, until today, they almost recede into the fabric of our lives. There's my MacBook Air next to a latte, each as inconspicuous as the other. At the same time, something interesting was happening to the telephone, a device that we historically used to amplify our voices beyond our biological limits. Again, it became mobile and then rapidly shrunk in size. And about 6 years ago, something interesting happened. We got possibly the first example of a phone that was more than a phone, and it was usable. And it was usable by regular human beings. And when I think of a device like that, I think about what it enables me to do, and I can't help but feel that this device gives me superpowers. What kind of superpowers? Well, I don't even need this device, to be perfectly honest. If we look into history, our devices have always given us superpowers. A watch gives you the superpower of knowing exactly what time it is. This is not a talent that you have biologically from birth. A compass, superpower to tell where you're going. A telephone, like I said, to project your voice beyond its biological limits. So our devices have always extended our senses and our abilities. But they've done more than that. When you write something down on a notepad, what are you really doing? Are you engaged in an act of communication? Or are you, in effect, extending your brain? I would argue the latter. So a notepad and a pen, for me, is an extension of my brain. We do the same thing with a camera, right? It gives me the superpower of instant recall. I don't have this. I don't have a photographic memory. Some of you might. Microphones, video cameras, same thing. So our devices have always extended our minds as well. What's interesting about a device like a smartphone is you take all of these things and perhaps add to them other superpowers, and you combine all of them together in a single device. That, to me, is very interesting. Because now we have a device that gives you all of these superpowers. And these devices are not just phones today. We wear them. We wear them on our persons. They are truly personal. And once they were disconnected, and once they were unaware of the world around them. Today, they are always on. They're always seeing, always hearing, entirely aware of their situation. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that today these devices are cybernetic extensions of ourselves. So what I'm trying to say is even though we don't have these devices necessarily implanted into our biological selves, that we are still today cyborgs. We, furthermore, are reliant on these devices. We are very quickly getting to the point where they are essential. We both manipulate and we experience the world around us via these devices. And if we don't have access to them, then we will have a harder time taking part in modern life. And how well they work determines whether they empower us or they enfeeble us. So let's take an example of a company that makes devices that a lot of people love, and I would say a lot of people probably feel empower them. Apple. Let's take a look at what they do. Examine. They have a range of devices, right? They've got desktops and laptops and tablets and mobile phones. But more importantly, they have something that ties all of it together so that these are not any more disparate experiences. If you have an Apple username and password and you can sign into iCloud, then you can enjoy what Joshua Topolsky calls a continuous client experience. What does that mean? I can start doing something on my desktop, continue on my mobile phone as I'm going home, maybe get home and then project that onto my TV screen and start and continue it there. Now, each one of these experiences is optimized for the device that it's running on. However, there is an overarching experience that I'm having, a continuous one throughout. So I'm not talking about cross-platform UIs, which is trying to get one cultural experience to work across every device. No, that doesn't work. What I'm talking about is very optimized experiences for every device and yet having a continuous experience. This is the world we live in today, the world of the continuous client. Google does exactly the same thing. If you examine what they have a range of devices, right? But they've always had the cloud bit, right? They were all about services. They've got great services, probably better services than Apple does. And again, all you need is a username and password from Google. You need a Google account, and all this is yours, right? So let's just see what's common here. They both control hardware, software, services, and soon they will also control connectivity. It's the next logical step. Now, software is a service today, so those are the same thing. But if you combine all of these things together, you get something rather special. If you can control hardware, services, and connectivity, you control the experience. And that's really, really important. Why? What happens if you don't? Here's an example. I was on a train in the UK in first class. I paid for first class because, as you guys know, you get a plug socket. That's basically what you get in first class for most of the time. And this was my experience trying to plug in my laptop. There's me trying to plug in my laptop in first class, which I paid a ridiculous amount of money to, and no, it's not working. You can probably see why it's not working. Now, of course, it is difficult to keep a determined geek down. I was traveling with an extension cable, but you can see that even with the extension cable, that plug itself, the cable is bent at an unnatural angle. Why? So how did this happen? The plug socket is perfect. It works perfectly. If you can plug something into it, it works. The table works perfectly. It's a great table. You put stuff on it, it stays there. What apparently nobody did was consider how they would work when juxtapositioned in this specific orientation. They didn't think about the whole experience. They only thought about the various features, right? This is what Steve Jobs was talking about when he said, we make the whole widget. We control the whole experience. This wasn't even the worst experience I had on this train. The worst experience came when I tried to leave the train and I was flummoxed. I had no idea how to leave this train because this is how you left a train. You would first wait for the automatically unlocking doors to be unlocked, and then you would open the window, And then you would put your arm out the window. And you would open. Yeah, who's been on one of these? Yeah? Okay. I did not know how to, I thought I was going to have great adventures on this train, meet new people, because I would not be able to leave. So who thinks this is ridiculous? Yeah, is this ridiculous design? Some of you. There was a time when this was excellent design, when this was great design. When? This was an old train. So there was a time when this train did not have automatically locking doors. Now, if you're in a train that's proceeding along at great speed, and you accidentally open the door and you step outside, what happens? You have a bad day. So there was a time when this train didn't have automatically locking doors that making a gesture that had possibly catastrophic consequences as hard to perform as possible made great sense. They made it difficult for you to die, right? That's great design. What happened was things changed. It got a new feature, automatically locking doors. What they didn't then do is go back and say, how does this affect everything else? How does this affect the whole experience? They just tacked it on. And we do this in software today, and we do it in hardware today, right? New feature, let's just put it in there. No, it affects everything else that's in there. Your experience will be as strong as its weakest link. Whatever is weakest in the experience will determine the level of the experience. This is why control is so essential. If you don't have this, you get stuff like this. This was my Samsung phone that they gave me to try out. When I first turned it on, it said, error, no SIM card or phone is turned off. Think about it for a moment. How does this happen? Easy, very easy. If you have people who are only thinking about the hardware, other people who are only thinking about the software, then for someone who's only thinking about the software, what error conditions could possibly be the result of this? Well, these two. Let's just put them into a string and we'll have that displayed at some point, right? We're not even thinking about the whole experience again, so this can happen very, very easily. And the important thing to remember is that consumers do not view products as separate features and separate parts. They don't go, oh, right, there must be a problem with like the REST web service and that's why this happened. Maybe somebody didn't escape the string properly or something. No. Right? They go, this is shit, it doesn't work. Or I love this, this is awesome, it helps me in my life. Right? We're not living in the age of features anymore. There was a time when features were important because every feature did a very important thing. It made something previously impossible possible. And if that's the case, if it's a difference between, say, being able to send someone to the moon or not, then who cares how difficult it is to use? You don't have an alternative that's easier, you are going to use it. But at least in the consumer space, today we have feature parity for most things that matter. And if you have the same features, you can't compete on that. What you can compete on is the experience. Today we're living in the age of experiences. And features are a commodity. One of the companies that makes one of the remotes that you see in this photo understands that. And you can see it. You can see it because their design is not something that their great designers did. Their design is a symptom of them understanding this fact and thus creating the organization in a certain way and creating their development processes in a certain way. So, companies that do get it, Apple, Facebook, Twitter, Google when they make their own products, forget Android. The Android ecosystem is a clusterfuck. Sorry if there are kids in the room. You already know what that means. They do. What is common? What is common with these services that do get it, with these companies that do get it today? They're all closed. They're all closed silos. So you might be thinking, so what, Aral? What's so bad about closed? There's nothing wrong with it. Well, I'm glad you feel that way. I am, because this is the perfect time to tell you about my new startup. I'm really excited about this. Somewhat of a sales pitch, but bear with me. So it's called Snail Mail, and we've done something special. With Snail Mail, we have solved an important problem, the problem of real mail. With Snail Mail, for the first time in history, you will get free, real mail forever. Send as many letters as you want, as many packages as you want, to as many people as you want, forever. Who thinks this is a great idea? Who would use this? Who would use Snail Mail? Come on, you know I'm leading you on, but you would, wouldn't you? You really would. Some of them are like, this is not going well. This is going to take a turn for the worse. There is a caveat. We do open your letters, and we do read them. But we only do this so that we can provide you with helpful guidance as to products that you might want to buy. Don't know. Ooh, that slide's messed up. Okay, that's supposed to say I'm sore all over from the walk. Anyway. Nice. But then what we do is we just put everything back in the envelope. You wouldn't even know we were there, right? Who'd use this? Far fewer hands. There's always one or two, right? Some people will do anything for free. That's part of the problem. That's part of the problem. But the rest of you, I mean, I'm sure some of you use Gmail, right? Now, there might not be a person reading your letters, but they're still reading them. They're still learning about you, about what you're saying to other people. So snailmail.com, please do share it with your friends. We're very excited about this. I think it's going to be big. We might even have an IPO at some point. It'll be great. We'll all celebrate it. So why? Why does Google do this? Are they evil? Is it a conspiracy theory? No. You don't need conspiracy theories when you have the simplicity of business models. It is their business model. Their business model is to monetize data. There is no hidden, treacherous conspiracy here. It's very transparent. This is how they make their money. So they make their money by monetizing your data. So you might say, so what? You know, I give it to them. I give it to them freely. It's fine. Well, let's do a thought experiment. I talked to you briefly about user experience. What would be the ultimate goal of experience design, since experience design is so important in the age of experiences? I call this theoretical device the experience machine. The experience machine is a machine that knows everything about the world, it knows everything about you, and it can read your mind. Now, if we could build this, we could all go home today, because our work is done, right? So a machine that knows everything about the world, it knows everything about you, and it can read your mind. Let's take a look at how close a company like Google is to building the experience machine. Now, Google has a plethora of services that they offer that know where things are, they know what's happening in the world, what are people looking for, what are people talking about, right? They also have a lot of services that know about you, where you are, what you're doing, who your friends are, your social graph, etc., etc., etc. They have a health spin-off now, so they'll know how you're feeling intimately. And the bit where we're talking about reading your mind, well, that's what we do with devices, right? That's what we're trying to get to. Ideally, we would have a device that could read your mind. We don't, so we need to communicate right now by other means. So they have devices and services, and soon they'll be giving you connectivity in order to create that part. Things like Google Glass, Google Now, Fiber, etc. So when I see this diagram, it makes me think of a hydra with many heads. So Google has fingers in a lot of pies right now. Services. So Google started out as a service, right? As a simple search engine. And the simplicity was the bit that won us over. I switched from one day to the other from Alta Vista, and that was it. Never looked back to Alta Vista. Heard it died recently. But Google was very different when it was a search engine. When it was a search engine, they weren't even tracking you initially. They only started tracking you after 9/11 and after the Patriot Act was passed. This isn't even in their original privacy policy that they link in their history of privacy policies. If you go to the Internet Archive, there's a privacy policy that's not on that list. The first one, where they weren't even tracking you. And today, of course, they have a plethora of services. So you can put anything you want on Google. You can have all of your emails there via Gmail. You can have all of your files via Google Drive. You can put all of your calendars so they know what you're going to be doing, what you've been doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there are a lot of games that you can play with Google. Some of them are not explicit. So if you've ever used a reCAPTCHA, that's used to protect forms on the internet. What you're doing is not only proving that you're human, but you're also helping Google to digitize books. That might be like a great, that's kind of cool, right? I mean, that is kind of cool. But they have explicit games as well, like Ingress, where you walk around in teams and you photograph monuments. And what you're really doing is giving Google very valuable data about pedestrian traffic patterns, right? So they give you games in order to get this valuable data that they need. The devices are just a continuation of this. So when you look at a beautiful Nexus 4, and they are beautiful, when they make their own products, when they control hardware, software, and services, they make beautiful experiences. Google gets UX today. That's why they're so dangerous. They were much less before. When you get a Nexus 4, this is a beautiful, gorgeous data entry device. Why do you think a Nexus 4 is half the price of an iPhone 5? Because it's being subsidized. Why is it being subsidized? Because your data is worth way more to Google. So this is an easy way to input your data. Same with their tablets, same with the Chromebooks. What's happening here? If you have a service like Google Search or Google Drive or Google Mail, you can choose to use somebody else's service and then they don't get your data. Now, what happens if I give you a device and I say to you, you must sign into this device with your Google username and password? Now, no matter what service you use, they will still get some valuable data, right? So what's the end game? If your company is built on data, on monetizing data, what's the end game? The end game is connectivity. And this is where Google is going next and today. So with Google Fiber, for example, your sign-in for the internet is your Google username and password. So because think about it again, with devices, you could choose to use an iPhone. You could choose to use a Firefox phone, right? But if they give you connectivity and your sign into the internet is your Google ID, they're going to get valuable data no matter what device you use. That's the end game. And it's not just for the first world. They're also going to be providing it for the third world with projects like Google Loon, which aim to connect the next X million, or billion actually, to the internet. Via what? Their Google username and password, right? And Facebook is trying to do the same thing with internet.org. So there will be people in the near future whose only experience of the internet is a network that you sign into with your Google username and password. Think about the ramifications of that. So again, with services, you can always choose a different service. With devices, you can choose to use a different device. The end game is making your internet sign-in, your Google or your Facebook sign-in, because then they'll get data no matter what. So this reminds me, not so much of a Hydra now, but much more like Audrey 2 in Little Shop of Horrors. Audrey 2 in Little Shop of Horrors is a mutant space plant that needs blood to grow. And Google needs your data to grow.
Does it have to be human?
It gathers data about the world.
Does it have to be mine?
And data about you.
Where am I supposed to get it?
And it does that by giving you discounted services and devices.
'Cause if you feed me small, I can grow up big and strong.
Why? Because that's their business model. It's very simple. It's the business model of any free service, right? There is no such thing as free. Free is a lie. So what? Well, you might say, hey, you know, it's fine. I give them my data. I sign up to this. I get valuable services back. I'm okay with it. And I can control what's private and I can control what's not private. Can you really, though? So Facebook. Let's take Facebook, for example. All of the various things that are in your profile. Now, there was a time when none of these were shared with the entire internet, right? The defaults in your Facebook account were that your likes were only shared with you, your birthday, your contact information, and stuff that you made public was by default, stuff that you added, like your name, your picture, your gender, etc., was only shared with your network of friends or with all of Facebook, but never with the entire internet. But the problem is the defaults started to change. So in 2007, more started to be public by default. By 2009, 2010, when we reached 2010, everything apart from your birthday and your contact information is public by default. So, as Dana Boyd says, people can learn to work with private defaults or with public defaults, but when the defaults change, that's very difficult. Why do they change? Well, it's a dark pattern, right? A dark pattern is great design that confuses you because the confusion benefits the designer. Go to darkpatterns.org if you'd like to see more examples of dark patterns. So you might say, you know what, Aral, so what? Okay, the defaults might be changing, but I'll set them back to private. It's fine, and I'll have my private stuff, right? Well, they're also sharing stuff that you think is private. Now, this is the actual logo of the of Total Information Awareness, the Information Awareness Office, which didn't take off in the US, but this is what the US government wanted to do initially many years ago. And it didn't take off because I guess if your logo contains a freaking pyramid with an all-seeing eye with laser beams scanning the world, people get a bit scared. Stuff like that. But it didn't go away. It didn't go away. It just morphed. As the Edward Snowden leaks have shown us, the NSA does not understand PowerPoint design. But beyond that, these programs did not go away. And the companies that we trust with our data have been complicit in sharing that data with the US government. Now, there is one thing about this slide that I think we do need to acknowledge, and this is a positive. Microsoft was first at something, so I think that doesn't happen every day. I think that requires an acknowledgement. So what are they sharing? Everything. They are sharing everything. Anything that you might think is private to you, right? And when they're not sharing it, I don't know if you've been keeping up with the leaks, the NSA is tapping either the fiber optics, the GCHQ is doing the same thing here, by the way. We're no better. In a lot of ways, we're probably worse because we don't talk about it as much as the Americans talk about it. We talk about the Americans instead of us. But it's being shared. So why? Well, because it's easier for governments to get this data that we've volunteered to corporations rather than to surveil it themselves. They would need to go through much more convoluted processes if they needed to actually get this information themselves. So what Andrew was saying at the beginning is spot on. And I think Bruce Shiner was saying that in a talk recently, that the NSA didn't just wake up and say, hey, let's just spy on everyone. They said, hey, these corporations are spying on everyone. Let's get in on the game. So if there is one party to fear more, I think I know which one that is. Now you might say, so what? Well, surveillance is an intrusion. And I think the real question to ask is how severe an intrusion is surveillance? Now, if we are truly cyborgs, if our devices are cybernetic extensions of ourselves, if when I type something into my phone, into the notepad, for example, I am actually extending my brain, if that is an extension of my RAM, right? We have to ask the question, where do we draw the boundaries of the person? Because I think it's very important to ask this question. Depending on how we answer it, surveillance becomes either a bad thing or a really terrible thing. This is how we normally draw the boundaries of the person. We have our own boundaries at our biological boundaries, and our devices have their own boundaries. But what if we drew them differently? What if we drew them like this? What if our devices are actually cybernetic extensions? Then what does surveillance become? Then surveillance becomes an intrusion into the person. It becomes an assault. And this is how I view it. So, especially if it's this dire, I'm sure these companies really care about this and they're doing something about it. So let's hear from Eric Schmidt. Let's hear from Eric Schmidt. He says, "There's been surveillance for years. I'm not going to pass judgment on that. It's the nature of our society." Okay, Eric, well, what should we do?
If you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. Or maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place.
If you have something you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. Now, I have to give it to Eric. He is a stand-up guy. He didn't just say this. He then went and created several websites onto which he uploaded his own personal photographs and videos. Some of my favorite ones are ericstoiletantics.com. I really think that's kind of cool. Eric's favoritesexytimes.com is a good one, if you get to see that. But my favorite of all is ericsmasturbationadventures.com. That's got some very interesting video clips in there. Now, of course, none of these websites exist. There's always one. Nor should they. Because privacy is not about having something to hide. Privacy is about controlling what you want to keep to yourself and what you want to share. Furthermore, it is a fundamental human right, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in Article 12, to be exact. So this is the problem. Now, if we leave it at the problem, it's a very depressing spot to leave it at, right? If you want to learn more about the problem, and if you want to tell your friends about it, there's a great documentary called Terms and Conditions May Apply, which came out a few months ago by Cullen Hoback. And it's available, I think, on Vimeo on demand, on Netflix in the UK, iTunes, depending on your region, you'll be able to get it on one of those. Highly recommend that you watch it. It's non-technical, and it makes the case. I've used a couple of clips from that. That's tacma.net. But that's the problem. What is the alternative? Mostly, we leave it at the problem and we go despair. I can't tell you stop using Facebook. I can't tell you stop using Twitter. I love Twitter. I'm addicted to Twitter. I use Facebook to keep in touch. Unless we have an alternative, we can't just give you the problem and be done with it, right? The alternative, let's look at it. How else can we build the experience machine from before? Can we build it differently to how Google is doing it? I think we can. Knows everything about the world. That is the realm of open data. We need to be supporting initiatives like OpenStreetMaps, etc. Lighthouse itself has become a node of the Open Data Institute, and there are 13 of them in the world now. Whenever you have proprietary data, we need to create alternatives so that we can build the experience machine. Knows everything about you? Well, that is where owning your own data, and more importantly, the intelligence that's derived from that data, comes in. And finally, the bit about reading your mind, well, that's where open source comes in, right? Because what we need to do is get to a point where we're owning our own data, our own tools, and the intelligence derived from those tools. The data is not enough. Your data is just raw materials. That's what Google does. You are the quarry being mined. You're not the product being sold. It's worse than that. You're the quarry being mined. You are the livestock being farmed. Your data is just raw materials. That's not where the real value is. The real value is in the intelligence that's derived from that data. You combine all three of these, and you get what I call your digital self. And owning your digital self is easy. I don't know why we're not all doing it, okay? 3 steps. I'm going to give you 3 steps, and we can all go home tonight and do this. You guys ready? Number 1, you clone the Git repository of an iCloud alternative that has social features built in as well. Okay? You with me? Number 2, you configure and you deploy it onto your own server. Right? And the best bit, number 3, you just ask all of your friends to do the same. It's not easy. And that's the biggest problem we have. And it's never going to be this easy. You're never going to see it on the context menu of an iPhone. I should really update that slide to iOS 7, but I'm loath to do it. I just updated myself, and it's painful. I miss my shiny icons. But yeah. It's never going to be there, right? Why? Because closed likes closed. Closed knows how to work with closed. Closed does not want to work with open. What we need to do is build our own stack, and it has to be seamless. We need beautiful defaults. A lot of times when you think about open, when people talk about open, it's all about exposing the seams. We must expose the seams so we have choice and it's hackable and it's great. We don't need to expose the seams. We can layer the seams. We can have beautiful defaults and then still have the seams, one layer underneath where anyone who wants to get at them can. And we get the best of both worlds. But there's a problem with open source today. And I'm going to exemplify that by using Linux. Who in here uses Linux as their main machine?
I use it in my car.
You use it in your car. That's probably dangerous, but otherwise good.
Runs my car.
Okay, this is a slightly more technical audience than normal. So this is how Linux developers think the world works, right? Number 1, you find the best piece of hardware. Right? You go in, you get the fastest CPU, the most amount of RAM, you got some refrigerating cooler or something in there. It's awesome, blue neon, right? Yeah. Number 2, you download just the right distribution. You might have to compile the kernel yourself just to get it just right, right? Or you use a DVD. We all love those, right? They're modern stuff. And then you're happy. Right? This is how the world works. No, this is how the world really works, right? You buy a computer, and then you're happy. There's no step 3, right? And this is how Linux really works. You're like, oh my gosh, okay, so which piece of hardware do I get? Is this going to be compatible with the distribution of Linux that I have? And is the Wi-Fi going to work? Because I really need to get on the internet. And then what's an operating what system download? What's a DVD? And is the Wi-Fi going to work? And then you're just like, what the fuck? Why isn't the Wi-Fi working? I just want to send a fucking email. And then there's a 4th step. You buy one of these, and you're happy.
Yes.
Right? I'm going to give you another example with 6 Mozillans in the room. Firefox OS. So Firefox OS is probably the best example of an alternative that we have in the consumer space right now that is open. So I bought one when it first came out. And I used it for a week. And this is what I urge you to do. Do not review products on screenshots. These are interactive devices. Do not review them on ideology, right? Live with them for a week. Does it empower you or does it enfeeble you? Base it on that. So I lived with it for a week. This was hello. It said, hi, set the date. Oh, okay. And I am going to go out on a limb here and say that probably nobody bought this phone in 1980. So why do I have to scroll through 30 years to get to where I want to be? This apparently was a valid error message. I reinstalled the operating system twice, thinking there was something wrong with my phone, until somebody else said, I'm getting those XML errors too. Okay. This was the opening screen of the Maps application. I do apologize if you can't read it. Neither could I on the screen. In fact, in the Maps app, there was a button, the square-ish round little dot there, that I've never been able to hit. It became a casual game. When I was bored, I would fire it up. I'm like, will I be able to today? No. Damn it. No high score for me. I ended up with 2 versions of the Twitter application. I do not know why. All I know is one came from one app store, which I remember being on that screen, and the other came from the other app store. The difference being one of them had text large enough for me to read and use the application, the other didn't. This is me sending a direct message, probably quite a soppy one, to my girlfriend. If you can't see the message I'm writing, that's okay. Neither could I. The keyboard is covering it. And the last example was the one that made me, probably enfeebled me the most. I was coming back from London to Brighton, so I wanted to check the train times table, train times website, and I couldn't get it to run. It just would not render, which meant that I went to London Bridge, realized that all of the trains were cancelled, and 2 hours after I should have been back, I was at home, which meant I lost 2 hours that I could have spent with my girlfriend and my dog. This is what the products we make do. They either enfeeble people or they empower people. And it's very, very important that we understand that the fact that it's open is not enough. The fact that it's open is a prerequisite to doing a lot of the things that we want to do to make the world better. But we can't make the world better by enfeebling people via the user experience. So open source today is features-led. We are still in some ways living in this bygone era where features mattered. It's a sandbox for enthusiasts. What do I mean by that? Well, we usually separate users into several categories. One common one is enthusiast. I don't like the word geek. You'll see why. Enterprise or business users and consumers, right? Some people say that these are stages. All technologies go through these stages. I don't believe they're stages because technologies exist in all 3 of them simultaneously, or can. Some people make these their identity. If you're an enthusiast, you're always an enthusiast, and you're an enthusiast about everything. You're a geek, right? You're a geek. You just care deeply about everything in the world. If you work in a business, you're a suit. If you're a consumer, you're a mere mortal, or worse, a dumb user, right? I don't believe these are identities, because I believe you can play these roles in your life as a single person, play all of these roles. So imagine that you have a car, a classic car that you love, right? You're an enthusiast when it comes to this car. You love it when it breaks because you want to tinker with it. You want to take it apart. You want to put it back together. You want to know exactly how it works. But for work, you drive a truck. Do you care about the truck? Not really. Did you buy the truck? No, somebody else bought it. What do? You just drive the frickin' truck. If it breaks down, not your problem, right? Do you want to know exactly how it works? Probably not, depending on how dedicated you are. And maybe you have a car that you drive to work, to drive your truck. Come on, bear with me. It's hard enough finding analogies. Now, you just want that car to work, because if it doesn't work, you don't want to take it apart and fix it. You're going to be late for work, and you're not going to get paid. So I believe that these are roles, and we all play these roles. The problem occurs when we expect enthusiasts, people playing the role of enthusiasts for their subject area, to create products that also magically are great experiences for consumers. I call this trickle-down technology. And just like trickle-down economics, it doesn't work. Trickle-down economics is an economic theory that's favored in the States. Says if you enable wealthy people, hugely wealthy people, to become hugely wealthier, somehow that additional wealth that they've generated will trickle down to people who are less fortunate. Now, given that in the States, again, 40% of the wealth is owned by 1% of the population, I think we're still waiting for trickle down in the States. And similarly, in the consumer world, we're still waiting for trickle-down technology. And the reason for that is enthusiasts creating products for enthusiasts doesn't automatically trickle down to usable consumer products. This is why we've been giving people PCs for 30 years when all they wanted were iPhones. And then, even worse, calling them stupid. When you're designing for the needs of a certain audience, don't be surprised if you magically end up meeting the needs of that audience alone. The other problem we have in open source is these democratic ideals in a development process. Design is not a democracy. I'm going to give you an example. So Mike Evangelist's company was bought by Apple to build a product called iDVD. And he tells the story of how they went in for a meeting with Steve Jobs. And before they went in, they prepared all of this documentation, artifacts, wireframes and prototypes, etc., showing exactly how this product was going to work. And he tells the story of how Steve Jobs walked in, and he ignored that, went up to the blackboard or a whiteboard and just drew a rectangle and said, that's your window. And he drew a burn button, said, that's your burn button. And what you do is you drag a video into the window and you press the burn button and you get a DVD, and that's what we call iDVD. And that's what I call focus. Because design is about focus. It's not about if 3 people have implemented a feature a certain way, let's put all 3 in there and then put a preference setting in the settings app or something, right? That's not how we do it. It's about saying no, 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 no to things and having someone who has the authority to say that no, having an editor. And it's not veneer. Design is not about making things pretty. It's not about prettifying things. It's not about finishing everything else and then handing it over to a designer and going, make this lovely. That's makeup and rouge. It has to come from the top. Design is not something that designers do, that great designers do from the bowels of your organization. No matter how great your designers are, unless the focus on design comes from the very top, you're not going to create beautiful designs. Because design, great design, is a symptom of a design-led organizational structure and development processes. So we have to design the organization before we can design the product. Because design and development are facets of the same thing. They are not separate things. Design leads development, and development informs design. Perhaps we have this notion of design being a magical thing because we think it's something that people who dress in all black do and it's artistic. And no, it's not. Let's knock it down a few notches. Design is merely assumption. It might be more educated or less educated, but it's assumption. We only understand the thing that we're building when we start building it. It's like making a pot. You have to touch the clay. You can design a pot, but until you start touching the clay, until you start understanding your materials, until you understand where the limits of those materials are, you don't really understand the thing that you are making. And of course, all of this has to come out of a vision. You can't ask people what to build. They're not the experts. We are. It all comes out of a vision. Your assumptions, any tests have to be filtered through that. We don't just take what everyone tells us and implement it. And so on and so on. And we do this every 2 weeks, not every 2 years, right? Because the ladder is waterfall and it's caca. That's a word. So it's not about drawing a straight line. It's not about pixel pushing, and it's not about making things pretty. Design is about psychology and neuroscience and sociology and linguistics and philosophy. It is about understanding humans so that we can make things for humans. What kind of things? Things that empower them, things that delight them, things that make their lives better. So we need a new category of open technology. We need to create design-led organizations so that we can create experience-driven open technologies, because it is a missing category of technology. Look, we have features-driven closed products. They're the norm today. The Nokias, the Microsofts of the world, the Samsungs of the world when they're not copying Apple, right? We've got experience-driven closed. We've got the Apples, the Googles, the Dysons of the world, right? But we only have features-driven open. We have a whole missing quadrant of technology, and that needs to change before we can fix the other problem. Experience-driven open is the missing quadrant of technology. So what? Well, all of these companies that we say that get user experience, that are closed, and remember how we said the alternative is to owning your own data? What I call indie data, what we need to empower regular people to own their own data, that's not going to happen without creating experience-driven open technologies. Because experience-driven open technologies are a necessary prerequisite to this. And if we do it right, we will actually have a user experience advantage over the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. Why? Because our needs will be perfectly aligned with the user's needs. Our needs will be to just create a beautiful product. Why? Maybe because we sell it to them, right? It can be open and you can still sell it. What we don't have is what Facebook has and what Google has. Their needs are orthogonal to the needs of the users. Their needs are to monetize users' data. None of you, I'm going to bet, wakes up in the morning and says, today would be a great day to find a service that monetizes my data. You might say, I want to use a service that I can talk to my friends with, or I want to talk to my friends. That's your goal, right? So what happens? Facebook implements something. We all freak out. They go back. And then we're like, oh, okay, it's okay, it's okay. And they implement something else, which is a privacy issue, and we all freak out. Why? Because their goals are orthogonal. With experience-driven open, we would actually have an user experience advantage, which is the only advantage you need in the age of experiences. So if you want to find out more about that, look at indiedata.org. And we can do this. I call it the pendulum of progress, because it sounds kind of cool. And I just made it up today. Animating a pendulum in Keynote is hard, I found. Because it has happened in the past. Initially, we had mainframe computers. They were centralized. Sorry, the slide's a bit cut off. And then we got personal computers. What did personal computers do? They decentralized the system. But then what happened? We got the web. It was meant to be open. But instead, it was very favorable to close silos. And it became centralized again. We're going to have a next chapter to this. And that's going to be decentralized again. And that's what Indie Data is going to give us. So we had mainframe computers. They became decentralized into personal computers. We got the web. It got centralized again. The next step is Indie Data. And I'm not just talking about this. I'm doing something about it. I have a startup that's starting up called Prometheus. And we are going to build a phone. We are going to build a phone in the sense that we're going to build the hardware, the operating system, and the core services around it. And we're going to control those. And we're going to do interesting things with connectivity because we have a very interesting set of constraints. What we're not going to do is we're not going to partner with one of the huge telecommunications companies and carriers. Why? The moment we do, we lose the ability to control the user experience because we are not as strong as them. And design is all about power. So I showed you the Firefox OS phone. The problem there is not that Mozilla has bad designers. I'm sure Mozilla has excellent designers. And I know for a fact that they have excellent coders. The problem is the design decision that is the problem there was the deal with Telefonica. The problem is that Mozilla does not have control over the user experience, the end user experience. That's a design decision, not the color of an icon or how rounded your corners are. That's not design. So when we control these things, we are going to control the experience. And you'll be hearing more about it in the coming days. But if you want to learn more, go to codename-prometheus.eu. That is a code name. The actual name is much friendlier. So today we stand at a crossroads. And before us are two paths. One leads to a digital free land of people who own their own data, devices, and services. And empowered by this, can protect their privacy, civil liberties, and human rights. And the other leads to a digital feudalism populated by digital serfs who don't even have the option of owning their own data, devices, and services, but must rent them from corporate landlords. And enfeebled by this, they enjoy neither privacy, nor civil liberties, nor human rights. We stand at this crossroads and we must ask ourselves, can we afford to choose the wrong path? So I say to you, join me. Let us bring design thinking to open source. Let us start making experience-driven, open products that empower everybody, not just enthusiasts, to own their own data, devices, and services so that they can safeguard their privacy, their civil liberties, and their human rights. I say to you, join me, and let us take the road less traveled. Thank you. I just also want to say thank you to the people that made this presentation possible. I used a number of clips from the documentary Terms and Conditions May Apply, which I talked to you about during the talk itself. Also, I want to thank Daniel Rosen, who let me use a still of his installation, the weave mirror, which uses hundreds of little motors inside of an actual weave to mirror what a camera is seeing in front of it. Kind of cool. And my friend Kyle Bean, who let me use his photo. He makes these out of cardboard. They're really awesome. He's also based in Brighton. And I want to thank Chan Lo, whose cartoon I stole off the internet. I hope he won't sue me for it. But also the people who shared their photos and icons under Creative Commons licenses, both on Flickr and 500px and other places. If you're not aware of Creative Commons is an extension to copyright. It works within copyright, but gives you the ability to say not all rights reserved, but some rights reserved. I will let you use these photos without letting me know if you just credit me. Or don't use it commercially, and you can use these photos. And similarly for the icons that I used from the Noun project, which is a great repository of icons and iconography. So just want to say thank you to them as well, and thank you again.
Thank you, Aral. We've got a very short amount of time for some questions. So 5 or 10 minutes, and then we're going to open up the bar again upstairs if we want to have some further discussion.
See, the way we should do this is we should have like drinks in everyone's hands now.
Yeah, you're going to have to wait, I'm afraid,
Okay.
for the drinks. Should we take some chairs?
Sure. I mean, I've got mine. I just feel kind of bad. We've got little spots.
If
You got your tape there. Yeah. It's all very professional. There we go. Got a question back there. Who's running the microphone? Who's running the microphone?
Do we need a microphone?
Oh, okay, we've got an onboard. Okay.
If
you could get up and project.
Yeah, and also say
And
who
we'll
you are
repeat it.
as well, please.
Yes. Get up and project. Get up and project, yes. Going to make you work for this.
Thank you for a brilliant talk. It was really, really interesting.
Thank you.
There seems to be one of the real difficulties. You say, and I completely agree, design isn't a democracy, and if you look at the technology companies, and I guess Apple and Jobs is the greatest example, there has been a real control from someone or a small number of people, and that seems to really sit uncomfortably with the idea of open source, where contribution, the very existence of open source relies on contributions from a large body of people, and many open source organisations like Linux and Braco and all sorts of things try and create some sort of centralised control, but they are never able to create that kind of single person vision that someone like Apple has, and that seems to be a real problem with moving open source out of features-led, where lots of people contribute features, to an experience-led where one person has a holistic view on how it's going to work. I don't know if you have a view on how they get around that.
Definitely. Thank you for the question. It's a very good question. I think the question underlies certain assumptions about open source that are commonly shared. And one of those is what you said about how open source relies on a large amount of contributions. That's not necessarily the case. And it doesn't have to be a voluntary effort necessarily either. So it's very possible to create a new type of organization where you employ, initially at least, everyone who works there, you exercise control, and you make the source open. Now, I think Tim O'Reilly and his friends were very clear when they forked free software to create open source, that open source meant a very important single thing, that the source is open. They did that. In a sense, they stripped all of the moral considerations, the ethical considerations from the Free Software Foundation for a reason, to make it palatable for businesses. That's why open source took off and open source became what it is. I personally believe it's time to inject some of that ethics and morality back into it, to be perfectly honest, not saying that we should go full Stallman, but we should definitely think about it. But what we don't need to do is to harbor that assumption that we need a lot of people volunteering their time and effort, and thus it has to be, consensus-based, etc. You can create an organization, hire everyone on it, make the source open, step one, right? And then say, fork it. Go for it. Fork it, guys. We're not going to keep it to ourselves. You'll be able to fork the server, fork the operating system. As much as we can make the hardware open, that's a very hard problem right now. I want to make it as ethical as possible as well. Fork that as well. We don't have to pull it back in, right? If we see that something interesting is happening and there is interest, great. And that's great, and we can fork that back in. But open source doesn't mean that it needs to be a community-led initiative. And I think we mix that up, and some people go, if it's not, then it's not open, man. And we can't harbor this way of working. Because if we do, it's fine. We've been doing it for 20 years. And we've been doing free software for 30 years before that in the Stallman vein. And we don't have a single example of a product in the consumer space, I would argue, that has mainstream adoption. And we need that. This is not just a criticism of existing systems. We need it because our civil liberties rely on this. Whether or not we do this, whether or not we create usable open products in the consumer space, will determine the kind of society we live in. And I think that's an important enough thing that we can try, at least, to create this. Does that answer your question?
One more question at the back?
Okay. Take the Mozilla guys as well.
Yeah, go for it, please.
I represent several vendors of open source based solutions.
Not today here, right?
But
and we just wanted to say.
Just to say that open source, it's a bit okay because there are too many hats, going in different directions. There is something new that's called open core, so take the open source and
it's called what? Open core?
Open core is called now. It's commercial open source. So get a good idea, make it ready for enterprise use, support it, and so on.
You said the E word in public, man.
Sorry?
You said the E word in public. Even I didn't swear that badly. Keep going.
Okay. But anyway, it's a good step forward. Naturally, what you're trying to do improves even more, what we have been trying to do in the enterprise segment.
Again, there's nothing non-commercial about open source necessarily. I mean, there are open source companies that make a lot of money. Some of them are not-for-profit, some of them are for-profit. And again, I'm talking about the consumer space specifically. If you look at infrastructure, the internet runs on open source. It's hugely successful. But there are commercial vendors that are making profit from it, etc. I mean, we're going to sell this phone. And we might also have a service where we take care of your data. It's your data, your server. If you want us to make it seamless, maybe we'll take care of it. Maybe it'll be a little device that you have at home. Maybe it'll be a combination of the two. Providing availability when data is decentralized is a hard problem as well, especially if it's peer-to-peer. So, but it will be commercial, not because I want to make a lot of money. I mean, goodness knows, if that's what I'd wanted, I'd be way richer 10 years ago. But we have to make it sustainable. And also, I want to prove to people that this is a viable business model. Not open source itself, that's been proven. But experience-driven open, that it can work, and it can. Please. Yeah, go for it.
So I really like the point that you made about the fact that open source is not necessarily about like a bunch of enthusiasts that get together and build something. They can be, a company. Yeah,
and there's nothing wrong with a bunch of enthusiasts getting together and building stuff. Excellent stuff comes out of it. And don't get me wrong. That's important and necessary. But we also need the other. But please keep going.
So you've talked about how you can get to a great product with lots of designers if you have a sort of company-led open source project. Do you see the same kind of thing in a volunteer kind of project? Do you see a way to get designers involved in a project that people do against great
This is the thing that I keep seeing. Thank you for your question. I keep seeing this, and I think I've heard it, like, I'm friends with Chris Heilman. Like, Chris, whenever I have a criticism of something, goes, well, why don't you just submit a pull request? Design doesn't really work with pull requests. You will be able to get people to work for you, right? And you said volunteer-led, but like if you look at Mozilla, for example, you guys all work there, right? And you get a salary, right? The problem is, where are the designers in that hierarchy? If the designers are the ones who have authority to make design decisions, then you'll have a different structure and it will work. But more often than not, designers don't have that authority. It is led by engineers, it is led by programmers. It is a meritocracy in the sense that I can give you a formal proof of my solution and I win. There are very few formal proofs in humans. We're irrational, illogical, emotional creatures. So if I'm to be held at that, I can't in any way argue with you. And I'm a programmer too. I've been programming since I was 7. So I know both sides of the coin, and they're the same coin. So we need to include, what I meant about organizational structure is, we need to include designers, not just as volunteers, but as people who are running the show. And that's something that, if we can get past our egos and say, yes, someone's going to make a decision, right or wrong. That person is not, like when I'm making decisions for Prometheus, I'm going to be wrong and wrong and wrong. And then we'll iterate, right? Hopefully I'll be right as well every now and then. But the important bit is not whether you make the right decisions or not. Are you structured so that someone that has that focus, is keeper of that focus, is moving you along with focus? And then you can iterate and you can fix things that go wrong. Apple gets things wrong all the time. Hopefully, next time they iterate, they can make it better. It doesn't always work that way, And I keep giving Apple as an example because they are truly a unique company. And they were ever more so. Because the people matter. It's very cliche to say, oh, Steve Jobs is dead and now it's different. And it is. We're talking about humans. Every human makes a difference. And if we can instill this into our organizations, we will start making better products. Gosh, I went off on a tangent there. Does that answer your question at all? A bit? No?
There will be an opportunity with...
Well, does he accept it? Do you accept it?
I think it's interesting because what you're saying basically is that it's kind of like how when you want to recruit a designer in your project, you have to make a different deal than just you're not going to be judged by the number of commits that you have in the repo. It's a different thing. You have to offer them something appealing.
Exactly, and part of that is authority. You can't just have the responsibility without the authority. For any position, that doesn't work. But especially in your organizational structure, if design doesn't have the authority to design, then you won't get great design. And that authority is basically saying, we're not going to do a deal with Telefonica. We're only going to make 50,000 phones first, and we're going to iterate from there. That's what we're going to do. It's not saying we're going to make 1 million phones, because that's a design decision. But as long as we see design as aesthetics, we're not going to get there.
Okay, can we have one very brief question, please? One more.
One quick one.
John, one quick question.
Okay.
Oh, I'm liking this. You guys liking the questions? Can we have
There will be more questions upstairs with added wine.
Can we have 5 more minutes of questions? Who wants 5 more minutes of questions? Okay, cool. Keep going. I like the questions.
One observation, one question. One observation, isn't it funny that Google's inventing its own data island?
I don't think it's a data island, I think it's a showroom or something.
Put some C around their servers. That's really funny because obviously Prism can't reach across San Francisco Bay. So that's one thing. Second thing, question. Cultural organisations, and here we are in one, are almost exclusively all using social media. So they've hitched their pony, or in the case of cultural organisations, they're really tied on cardboard, to social media. They're basically completely enveloped in this Prism-dominated cloud.
Okay.
Cultural organisations often can't afford websites, and when they can, they're completely enveloped in this space. So going forwards, thinking in terms of 5 years, or 10 years even, and that's how the culture sector thinks, what should they do? What
Well, John, you're with the Arts Council, right? You're with the Arts Council.
Yeah.
Fund us. We can help. But yeah, basically fund it, build it. Build the tools that you need. Use the open source tools that exist maybe as a basis, but make this a priority, make it a problem, make them understand that this is a problem.
All right, yeah,
and then
okay.
fund
I'm
it.
a cultural organisation. What should I do? All right, I'm Black History Month in Brighton. What kind of information policy can I have that's going to be safe for 10 years in this environment? I'm not thinking about
Well,
the Arts
again,
Council.
you have to look into solutions where you can own your own data. But again, telling you this isn't enough if we don't build usable solutions. That's why I'm saying maybe set up a website where you guys start talking about this and exploring this in the realm of the cultural enterprise world or whatever you call it, and get the Arts Council to fund it and put some money into it so that we're not just talking about it, and start seeing what we can build, specific tools that actually fit the needs of these cultural organizations. Let's build them. We can't wait for someone else to do it, because if they do it, they're going to have other goals that they're trying to fulfill. I think we're in a position where we can make it happen. Yes, go, Dan.
So I think the self-serving question I want to ask you is, to what degree can the work that you're doing in Prometheus feedback into the open systems that Bill's trying to build with Firefox with us? But perhaps a more general question is, to what degree can design lab or experience that be introduced midstream in a project, and to what degree does it need to be there from the genesis? I think the gentleman in front of me mentioned that Linux runs as Spark, so in infrastructure, clearly you can bolt on design afterwards and take something that infrastructure-wise the user won't touch, but works, and add design, add experience. And Debian and Ubuntu is effectively fungible in terms of the technical underpinnings, but Marshall's goal was to take Debian and add experience.
Right.
Do you think that can be successful? Or?
Well, how successful is Ubuntu in the consumer space?
From what I've heard, it actually has a fair amount of retail presence outside of the Western world.
But still, in terms of percentages, we're talking very low percentages. And more than that, whenever Mark takes a decision that leads Ubuntu closer to being experience-driven, he loses X amount of his community, because that's not what they signed up for. They signed up for the meritocratic, democratic design process, and it's like, why have they taken these centralized decisions, and it's horrible and it doesn't look like Windows. I've been reading reviews the past few months about Ubuntu specifically to see how the community is reacting, and it's not pretty, because they've attracted that community. With Prometheus, I want to, as much as I want to attract the right people, I want to repel the wrong people, which is, to be perfectly honest, the old school guard of, long-bearded open source and free software people. No, I love you, Jan. You're different. But you know what I mean, right? I don't want to attract the Stallman crowd. I don't want to attract the crowd that's okay with the status quo of open source today. I would rather repel them and attract people who really care about the human side of the experience, because, like I said, if we don't do this, we have a window of several years where it's going to get much harder if we can't do this in the next few years. And to answer your other question, how can you implement this midstream? I think you can. Or can you? Yes, I think you can. But one of the reasons I'm not doing this with Mozilla and I'm not doing it with Canonical is I actually believe it's a huge problem. I mean, you can probably, since you're in the middle of it, understand how big of a problem it is to design a phone and to build a phone. I'm probably giving up the rest of my life to this. Hopefully we'll have one in a couple of years, but this is an ongoing process. I think, I'm doing this because I actually think that changing the culture of existing open source organizations is a harder problem. And I have the utmost respect for people who are going to hopefully try and do this. And I hope you guys are going to try and do this. But the problem is, there is, and I say this in the best possible way, a lot of entrenched culture and a lot of arrogance around that culture. as well that doesn't want to change and does not see a problem. And I think that's one of the biggest problems, if that answers your question.
Can we make this the final question, please?
Okay, so there was someone over there. No. All right, I'll take this.
Ubuntu Edge phone. What do you think?
What do you think? I get this every. Is it sexy? Did you say?
Like very similar to your idea, maybe.
Yeah. So Ubuntu Edge, for those of you who don't know, Canonical started an Indiegogo campaign, a crowdfunding campaign, to build a phone, which they build as the Formula One of phones. So the question was, what do I think about this? It sounds similar to Prometheus. Well, first of all, it is in no way similar to Prometheus, because Prometheus does not aim to be the Formula One of phones. If you think of Formula One, how that works in the car industry, you have Honda and Mazda and whatever, etc., and they have Formula One teams because they use those Formula One teams to learn things, to push the edges of technology so that they can implement them in their consumer line they can implement what they learn in their consumer line of products. That's why you have Formula One. Nobody just starts with a Formula One team and then builds a consumer line of cars. So I don't want a Formula One because we don't have the Honda Civic of open phones right now. And we need that first, and then maybe we can go and have a Formula One. So the idea isn't, again, it's very features-led. What is it? We're going to use the best elements that we can find, the best components that we can find, and it's going to have 2 operating systems on it, and it's going to dual boot, man. It's going to have it's like building a phone that has multiple personalities. Like why does my phone change personality when I connect it to a monitor and a keyboard? It shouldn't. It should probably adapt to what it's connected to, but it shouldn't have a completely different personality. They were talking about having a mobile OS and the desktop OS on the same thing and switching between it. That's kind of ridiculous. So it's not the same thing. But on the other hand, on a positive angle, it proved that you can raise, what was it, 24 million?
I think goal was 32 million, and it's like half of it, 50.
I think they were going for 32 or something. 32, yeah, and then they raised something like 20, in the 20s. Anyway, they proved that you can do that. And they broke every crowdfunding record. So I think that's a very positive thing. But no, I don't want to build the Formula One of open phones. Because I want to build the Honda Civic of open phones that you want to use every day. And it's reliable and works. Let's start from there, and then we'll get to Formula One. I'd love to do that someday.
Okay, let's wrap up the questioning there.
Okay,
there will be further opportunity for discussion upstairs. The bar will be open. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. And can we just have one more round of applause to thank Aral for his speaker?